Germany, and America are all represented.
For 3 decades, this famous racing track, placed like a giant footprint in the Surrey countryside, just 20 miles southwest of London, was the centre of British motorsport. The 2.5-mile circuit, with its 2 massive concrete bankings, was the very epitome of speed and captured the imagination of the period. What happened at Brooklands was news, and the drivers that raced there became household names.
Hello, Reggie, old man. How are you?
Hello, John, old boy.
Hello.
This promotional film, produced for the Austin Motor Company in the 1930s, was shot on location at Brooklands House, Weybridge, Surrey. It was the home of a wealthy landowner, Hugh Fortescue Lock King, and his wife, Ethel. In the summer of 1906, at a dinner party with some influential friends in the motoring world, Hugh Lock King found that he had volunteered to build, at his own expense and on his own land, the world's first purpose-built motor racing track. The Lock King estate bordered and partly included what they saw as the perfect setting for a racecourse. Over 300 acres of land where quiet woodlands sloped gently down to an area of flat, marshy farmland by the River Wey. Lock King himself was a keen motoring enthusiast and had been to see a big international motor race on the continent, and was disappointed that there were no British competitors. He was told that the British stood no chance in trials and competitions because there was nowhere in this country that British cars could be tested or raced. The speed limit on British roads then was 20 miles an hour, and the local constabulary was extremely alert in stopping and issuing summonses for all cars exceeding this speed. After hundreds of years of horse transport, resistance to the newfangled, noisy and smelly demon on 4 wheels was widespread. Lock King probably imagined the construction of a motor track as something similar to the golf course he'd already created, mostly landscaping of the woodlands with the addition of a track around the circumference of the site. The initial estimate was that the work would cost about £22,000.
I think Lock King has always been said to have done it for the benefit of Britain and the motor industry, and I'd hate to go back on that, but he did make money from things like a hotel in Egypt and properties in this country, and I wonder if he thought perhaps the motor car is now expanding, the motor movement is expanding, whether he saw something that might make money for him. If it didn't, well and good. If it did, it would be very nice. I have an idea he may have built Brooklands slightly from that aspect.
As soon as the design of the track was entrusted to Colonel H.C.L. Holden of the Royal Artillery, the original plans began to grow beyond Lock King's wildest expectations. Far from the idea of a simple road circuit, Lock King was persuaded that, in order for cars to achieve the highest possible speeds with the greatest possible safety, a 2 3/4-mile circuit would need to be provided with 2 huge banked sections, nearly 30 feet high. The track could be 100 feet wide, hard-surfaced, and include 2 long straights, one running for half a mile beside the London to Southampton Railway, and an additional finishing straight, passing the paddock and enclosures, bringing the total length of the track to 3¼ miles.
And obviously the cost went up and up when he was told he had to have high bankings, proper concrete surface on the track. But once committed, he, to his credit, went ahead.
The task of building this great motor course began in the autumn of 1906, and the Brooklands Automobile Racing Club was founded to administer the running of the future track. By January 1907, the colossal scale of the undertaking was becoming clear, so the specialist firm of Price and Reeves was contracted to take over the construction. The peace of this very rural part of Surrey was soon to be shattered by the activities of over 2,000 labourers and craftsmen, many drawn from other estates of Hugh Lock King, such as his farms in Sussex. 30 acres of woodland had to be felled and levelled, and the course of the River Wey was diverted in 2 places. 7 miles of temporary railway line was laid around the site and connected to the London to Portsmouth line, and locomotives were used to transport sand and ballast. The labour force was divided into shifts that worked around the clock 6 days a week. Steam shovels and steam grabs were used to help move thousands of tons of earth to build the 3¼ miles of track with its 2 massive bankings. But much of this work was still done with pick and shovel. In addition to the unique banked curves, features of the new motor course included the distinctive green-domed clubhouse, complete with a weighbridge for cars and changing rooms for competitors. The track had been designed so that the cutting for the steepest section of the track through a natural hill left an island which provided a panoramic vantage point where grandstands were built to house over 30,000 spectators. Access to this was gained by a steel bridge and a tunnel under the track. But ceaseless demands were made for more and more money to pay for the track. Lock King's health crumbled under the strain, so the task was taken over by Ethel, with support from her family and friends. On the 17th of June 1907, after just 9 months of work, the still unfinished Brooklands motor course was opened. This outstanding feat of engineering having eventually cost Hugh Lock King a personal fortune of £150,000, a price equal to millions of pounds today. On the brink of bankruptcy, averted by generous loans from his wife's family, he managed to make a modest speech to the distinguished and appreciative audience. There then followed a triumphant circuit of the track, Ethel leading in her Itala car, followed by members of the Brooklands Automobile Racing Club, including the president, Lord Lonsdale, and the vice president, Lord Montague of Bewley. Because Brooklands was the world's first purpose-built motor racing circuit, there were no previous examples to follow. To begin with, many of the rules and procedures were based on horse racing in order to try and attract a ready-made audience to this new and somewhat curious sporting venue. The first official race, on the 6th of July 1907, was heralded by the motoring press as a motor ascot. In true horse racing tradition, cars assembled in the paddock for scrutineering, weighed in before a race, were handicapped like racehorses, and lined up in the paddock stalls for numbering. Until 1914, drivers even wore multicolored silk smocks, imitating the traditional jockey's silks. But most of this was soon to change. Mr. A.V. Ebblewhite, who was starting the races at Brooklands from the first meeting to the last, and became the official starter in 1908, disliked the coloured smocks and also pressed for a better system of handicapping. Complaints that drivers were unidentifiable from a distance led to large numbered discs being placed on the backs of the cars. But Brooklands also nurtured another activity, quite unforeseen by Lock King, and indeed actively discouraged by the first clerk of the course, E. de Radukovsky. The earliest surviving film of Brooklands does not show motor racing, but ironically, aviation, the cuckoo that was eventually to push motor racing out of the Brooklands nest. Although frowned on initially, aviation was soon recognized as a crowd-pulling attraction and an additional source of revenue. Pioneer aviation companies rented sheds on the cleared central section of the track, despite the unresolved hazard of the famous sewage works. So Brooklands became a place unique in the world, where aircraft and motor cars were developed side by side through their most formative years. Before the first race was even run, Brooklands was the venue for a dramatic speed record attempt. A few days after the ceremonial opening of the motorcourse in June 1907, the motor racing pioneer, Selwyn Francis Edge, used the track for establishing a 24-hour record. With hundreds of roadside lanterns to mark the inner edge of the track and bright flares to illuminate the rim, Edge drove his green six-cylinder Napier for the whole 24 hours, covering 1,581 miles at an average speed of almost 66 miles an hour. Supported by two other Napiers on the run, Edge established a record which stood for 17 years. So from the beginning, record making and record breaking continued at Brooklands track, from the hundreds of class records and time trials to the more glamorous land speed record attempts. One of the earliest motoring films known of Brooklands is of another remarkable record attempt in February 1913. To drive 100 miles in 1 hour was one of the great objectives in early motoring. Here, engineers make a final survey of a specially prepared 25-horsepower Talbot at the Clement Talbot Works in North Kensington, before the car was driven by road to Brooklands. The pointed tail and attempts at streamlining of the car show the early benefits of the Brooklands track. On the morning of the 15th of February 1913, in front of a large crowd of press and public, the small but courageous Brooklands racing driver, Percy Lambert, achieved 103.84 miles per hour. The event was considered worthy of recording on this film and in the production of a small booklet. Lambert was a very popular driver at the track and had extensive experience of very fast cars, such as the Pearly Austins. Of the many people that turned out to support him, one may well have been Hugh Lock King, who had been there to witness an earlier unsuccessful attempt. Lambert's brother Harold operated the big dial indicator, and Lord Shrewsbury himself, the owner of the Talbot Company, congratulated the new record holder. Tragically, while trying to improve his own record a few months later, after promising his fiancée that he would attempt no more, Lambert crashed and was killed on the track. Many still say his ghost regularly walks at Brooklands in full racing attire. Of racing itself, the earliest known film happens to be of a more minor Brooklands event organized by the Motorcycle Club in 1913. Motorcycle racing attracted a different crowd of enthusiasts who could probably not afford the luxury of membership of racing clubs such as the BARC, but had the skill to build their own specials or adapt existing machines to the rigors of the track. The MCC organized trials and competitions, not just for motorcycles, but for sidecars and cycle cars too, at their regular meetings. In June 1914, the approaching war was foreshadowed when Queen Alexandra came to Brooklands on a field day and troop review to aid a local division of the Red Cross. Tents appeared all over the track and troops fought a mock battle. This rare film shows a military motorcycle event held after war had actually broken out. Hugh Lock King had surrendered the site for military use, and the Royal Flying Corps took over the grounds and the track. 2 motorcycle events were held, both organized by the British Motorcycle Racing Club, for men serving in the armed forces. One of these was the so-called all-khaki meeting, held on the 7th of August 1915. This film also shows, for the first time, scenes of the Test Hill, constructed in 1909 by the second clerk of the course, Colonel Lindsay Lloyd, as another facility to encourage use of the track for serious development and test work. But the war brought permanent changes to Brooklands in many ways. Aircraft production found a much stronger foothold when in 1915 Vickers moved into the old Italo works situated at the Fork. The aviation industry began in earnest, and Brooklands became the largest manufacturing centre in World War I. The solid tires of military lorries played havoc with the track, and it wasn't until 1920 that Lock King had cleared up sufficiently to enable the BARC to take over once again. Brooklands started to liven up in 1921, the same year as the first of the Junior Car Club's famous 200-mile races. The Talbot Dirac, jumping the start here, is driven by a pre-war driver, Malcolm Campbell, who returned to the scene from Army service as a captain. A race of 200 miles was considered a huge gamble, and some feared that Brooklands would run with blood. The race was, however, a huge success, and the crowds were enthralled to the end. The winner was another star driver, Major Henry Seagrave. The JCC 200-mile race became an annual event that attracted large crowds, as in this 1923 200-mile race. The poor state of the track can be seen by the cracks in the concrete in the foreground. In fact, a piece of concrete pierced the radiator of Joe Brown's Elvis, so that he and his riding mechanic had to change the radiator. Passengers on the London-bound train could gain a free grandstand view of the track if they passed at the right moment. But the war had changed more than just the state of the track. Many of those that survived it had experienced the horrors of trench warfare, and a new generation of drivers arrived, seeking challenge and excitement in the new abilities of motoring technology. Throughout the 1920s, the BARC continued to organize big popular race meetings that usually drew the largest crowds. There would always be a variety of fast and exciting handicap races on the outer circuit, which, when it was first built, was unique in the world as a place where motor vehicles could be driven flat out for hours on end without interruption. And racing on it remained a popular spectator sport for over 30 years. In August 1926, the RAC organized the first ever British Grand Prix, constructing sand chicanes and a somewhat hazardous bridge across the finishing straight. The same features were utilized for the Junior Car Club 200-mile race later that year. Number 2, the technically advanced front-wheel drive Elvis, driven by Morris Harvey, was to slide off the course backwards into a telegraph pole, bringing to an end communication with the timekeeper's box. The observer at the end of the finishing straight evidently has great faith in the driving abilities of the competitors. Once again, the race was won by Major Henry Seagrave in a Talbot. The same year, Hugh Lock King died, but Ethel, now a dame of the British Empire and honour of her work in the Red Cross during the war, continued active management of the Brooklands estate. She also regularly attended race meetings. The last land speed record achieved at Brooklands was when Ken Elm Lee Guinness, a member of the famous brewing family, drove the 350 horsepower single-seater Sunbeam at a two-way average speed of 135.75 miles per hour. This car, powered by a V12 Sunbeam Manitou aero engine, was soon after acquired by Malcolm Campbell and became his first Bluebird land speed record car. As speeds rose above 140 miles per hour, the British contenders needed more space than Brooklands could provide. They moved first to Pendeen and Southport Sands, then for 200 miles per hour and beyond to Daytona in Florida and Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. But as the center of British motorsport, Brooklands remained closely connected with the land speed record. One of the keys to this close connection was John Godfrey Parry Thomas, who was appointed chief engineer of Leyland Motors Limited in 1917. Given the task of designing a supercar, he was allowed to race one, became hooked on racing, and together with his friend Ken Thompson, set up the Thomas Inventions Development Company in workshops in the Brooklands Flying Village. One of his most famous cars was the 27-litre V12 Liberty aero-engine Babs, which was originally Count Zabrowski's Hyam Special. Zabrowski was one of the great personalities of Brooklands and raced a series of monstrous cars on the outer circuit, including the legendary Chitty Bang Bangs in the early 1920s. After Zabrowski's death in the 1924 Italian Grand Prix, Thomas bought the Hyam Special and adapted it for his land speed record attempts. He took the record twice in 1926, but was killed on Pendeen Sands while making another attempt in 1927. Brooklands driver Major Henry Seagrave took new records in the 1,000 horsepower Sunbeam and Napier-engined Golden Arrow. The Sunbeam owed much of its development to work in the Vickers Wind Tunnel at Brooklands. Following the death of Parry Thomas, Thompson, together with his colleague Ken Taylor, founded the firm of Thompson & Taylor. Seen here at Brooklands, outside Parry Thomas's former home, the Hermitage, with Thomas's dog, Reed Railton, the engineer, joined them as chief designer and established one of the most advanced motor engineering companies in the world. Based in their Brooklands workshops, Thompson & Taylor went on to design and build several land speed record cars, including 3 of Malcolm Campbell's Bluebirds. It was Campbell that called in Reed Railton to redesign the chassis and transmission of his 1931 Napier-engined Bluebird. The body shape resulted from testing in the Vickers Aircraft Factory's wind tunnel at Brooklands, supervised by R.K. Pearson, Vickers' chief designer, as he had with Campbell's first scientifically streamlined Bluebird in 1928, shown here being demonstrated on the Brooklands track. In 1933, Thompson & Taylor made more major changes to accommodate a supercharged Rolls-Royce R-Type 36.5-litre V12 engine, giving 2,500 brake horsepower. Campbell's ultimate land speed record car was the 1935 Bluebird, using the same engine but a new chassis designed and built by Thompson & Taylor at Brooklands. The body was built in the paddock shed once used by Malcolm Campbell as his showroom. In this car, Campbell took his 8th and final land speed record on the 3rd of September 1935 on Bonneville Salt Flats and achieved his longed-for target, averaging 301.13 miles per hour. Reed Railton also designed the body for the record-breaking MG EX135. On the 31st of May 1939, Major Goldie Gardner took the car to the Dessau Autobahn in Germany and became the first man to exceed 200 miles an hour in an 1100cc car. By the end of the 1930s, Brooklands was dominating the land speed record in every way, with the exception of actually being the venue itself. Another land speed record car, simply called the Railton, was a technological masterpiece, designed by Reed Railton and built at Thompson & Taylor's Brooklands workshops. It was commissioned and driven by the Brooklands ace, John Rhodes Cobb, who took the land speed record in it in 1938, 1939, and again in 1947, when he became the first man to exceed 400 miles per hour on land.
course, one of the big uses of Brooklands, really, from the time it was built almost, 1908 anyway, onwards, right up to, certainly the late 1920s, into the 30s in a way, was the attacking of records. And you did that, really, because you were paid bonuses. You see, the trade, the tyre people, the petrol people, the oil people, would pay you quite handsome bonuses for records that you broke, especially outstanding records like the R record and 12R record and that sort of thing. So there's a great incentive to set up a record, not too fast, and then go out a few days later and break it again and get some more bonus money. Or perhaps you worked in league with another driver who would take the record up by stages, so that you both got nice wallops of bonus money along the way.
Apart from mechanics and officials, the electric timing apparatus is the only observer, but it misses nothing, not even a split second, as the 7 crosses the line at amazing speed.
All manner of records were taken at Brooklands, particularly when racing finished for the winter months. Drivers made a living by seeking sponsorship to tackle records in many different classes.
The career of a miniature racing car is indeed a fast and furious one. The Austin 7 Special sets the pace that thrills, the pace that brings achievement.
The outer circuit record was the most prestigious. In 1930, the Daily Herald put up a trophy for the fastest driver round the track. Up to 1935, the trophy was won by just 4 drivers. Kay Don, the first winner, battled with Tim Birkin to achieve 137.58 miles per hour in his Sunbeam Tiger. In 1932, Tim Birkin took the record to 137.96 miles per hour in his famous Red Blower Bentley. It was, however, John Cobb who finally took the record to 143.44 miles per hour in his Napier Railton. Regarded as the ultimate Brooklands racing car, it was designed and built by Thompson and Taylor in their premises at the Brooklands Aero Village. It is seen here, outside their workshops, being test-driven for the first time in 1933. Powered by a 24-litre Napier Lion engine, the car's outer circuit record remained unbeaten when racing and record-breaking finished at Brooklands in 1939. Motorcycle racing started at Brooklands in 1908, and the British Motorcycle Racing Club, known as BEMC from its initials, was founded in 1909. The attendance at Brooklands motorcycle events was always quite small, being mostly knowledgeable enthusiasts and lacking the society element of the car racing crowd. However, an established pattern of race meetings emerged, and as speeds rose and the reliability of machines improved, races were held over greater distances. Following the end of the war in 1918, Brooklands was to witness the golden age of motorcycling, when the British racing motorcycle was the best and fastest in the world. Another club that staged ambitious races at Brooklands was the Elite British Racing Drivers Club, or BRDC. Their first event was the 500-mile race of 1929, which was destined to become the fastest long-distance race in the world.
I remember sitting on the pit counter during 500-mile races, wondering if there'd be any finishers, because the small cars would start about 11:30 in the morning or earlier, and the race would be still going on about 4 in the afternoon, by which time, of course, you'd have about 8 cars left, some of which would be running very badly, others were quite obviously going to stop pretty soon, and there was always 3 or 4 finished the race, but I used to wonder whether one day we'd see a race where there were no finishers, because it was a very punishing thing.
The other coveted BRDC trophy was the British Empire Trophy. Races of this caliber presented a challenge to great names, such as John Cobb, Sammy Davis, Tim Birkin, and the Dunphy brothers. From 1930, races on a smaller section of the track, known as the Mountain Circuit, were introduced by the new clerk of the course, Mr. A. Percy Bradley. This fast and furious 1 1/4 mile lap, providing a cross between road and track racing, was a tough course for the drivers and a stern test of acceleration, braking, and road holding for the cars. The Junior Car Club continued to hold races at Brooklands and organised club days for trials and driving tests, but it was most famous for its big international race meetings. The double 12-hour race, shown here, came about because nighttime noise restrictions meant 24-hour racing was not permitted at Brooklands. The event was divided into 2 daylight sessions, with the cars being locked up overnight. The 200-mile race continued to be run until 1928.
One or two people are beginning to criticise the place and say it wasn't real motor racing. You had to go on the continent to see road racing, which I couldn't agree more. Nevertheless, Brooklands did have some very important races, long races, exciting races. Does it really matter? Looking back on it, it was the most wonderful place. You had the International Trophy Race, which the Junior Car Club, very ambitious as usual, organised with a handicap race. But they used different channels at the fork, so the slow cars took lesser bends than the very fast ones, and the ones in between took sort of mid-type bends, so that in the end the cars came away from those bends level, or virtually level, so that the public hadn't got to worry about the handicapping. The leader on the road, or on the track as they came down to these bends, was virtually the leader of the race. So even if the continent is the place for road racing, and road racing may be a better thing, I don't know, for me track racing was fascinating in the extreme. And the really fast cars, you know, on the top of the banking, going around over 130 miles an hour, was something to see.
The only track in England for road racing is Donington Park, where many of the most important events in the racing calendar are now held. The complete circuit is over 2.5 miles in length and winds through picturesque woods.
Until 1933, Brooklands was unchallenged as the only motor racing circuit in mainland Britain. But in that year, the track at Donington Park in Derbyshire was opened for car racing. Further competition came in 1937 with the opening of a road racing circuit at the Crystal Palace in southeast London. Facing up to this, the BARC decided to construct a new road circuit at Brooklands, providing the maximum road racing track possible, without intruding on the outer and mountain circuits, the aerodrome, or the famous sewage farm. The new circuit, designed by and named after Sir Malcolm Campbell, zigzagged its way across the centre of the motorcourse, cleverly incorporating the old bank track. Opened in 1937, it proved popular with the increasing number of drivers who wanted to experience the thrills of this sport. Records for the Mountain and Campbell circuits were also highly prized, and both were eventually held by Raymond Mays, famous for his involvement in the development of the English racing automobile, or ERA. The ERA chassis was designed by Reed Railton and made by Thompson and Taylor at Brooklands. Cycle races were held more frequently during the 1930s. In 1933, a 100-kilometre championship trial road race was held there, promoted by the Charlottesville Cycling Club. The event was used to select a team for the World Championships at Montlhéry. The track continued as a regular venue for cycle races throughout the 1930s. In 1939 alone, 19 races were held between April and August. The 1920s and the 1930s also saw a boom in the home movie market. Anything that moved was fair game for the amateur cameraman, and together with shots of tea on the lawn, baby, or rowing on the river, Brooklands motor racing features in many private collections. Unlike the professional cameraman, focusing on starts and finishes or winners and losers, the amateur often turned his camera on behind-the-scenes activities, such as these so-called old crocs, parading in the rear paddock by the tuning sheds and workshops. A favourite filming point was the Fork Bend on the mountain circuit, where the cornering skills of drivers in Alfa Romeos, ERAs, Austins or Bugattis were put to the test. Nearby, behind the pits, the Dunlop tyre team worked ceaselessly. David MacDonald, or Dunlop Mac as he was known, was as much a Brooklands personality as the leading drivers of the time. A wonderful opportunity to film some top drivers is interrupted by the BARC's lorry. But patience is rewarded when some well-shot footage of John Cobb in his Napier Railton is bagged for this enthusiast's personal collection. In this early colour film, Kay Peter, in her characteristic pale blue overalls, takes the famous White Riley, forerunner of the ERA, for a spin on the Campbell circuit. When Hugh Lock King had Brooklands built, it was not just with racing in mind. He intended it as a testing ground for the British motor industry.
Even after this severe grueling and buffeting, we took the cars to Brooklands Racetrack and made them travel all out, lap after speedy lap. That their speed exceeded by a considerable margin, 65 miles an hour for the lap, is in itself proof that the Morris 10.6 is not merely a performer on any kind of road, but that it has the ability of holding its tune and maintaining its engine power for long periods of hard work under very arduous conditions. In other words, that it is definitely, like every Morris product, a car that you're proud to own.
Much development work was done on engine components by manufacturers, as this promotional Austin film shows.
Here is a familiar sight along the highways and byways, the Austin 7 on tour. But all 7 users are not so carefree. Just watch the hustle at the pits at Brooklands, preparing the mighty Atom for more strenuous work. They're off. Crack drivers and crack cars lap the famous track at incredible speeds. The Atom sweeps by at over 100 miles an hour.
We wanted to find out if the 100-pound car could do 100 miles per gallon and 100 miles per hour. So we took a standard side valve cylinder block and fitted it with a supercharger, but using mostly standard parts. The frame, for instance, was of standard design with semi-elliptic springs front and rear, and with provision for the tank at the back, a standard feature. The body, of course, was special, based on a carefully worked out streamlined design with a radiator outside the nose of the shell to decrease wind resistance. The original trials took place on the road soon after dawn one morning. Then, after examination at the works, it was taken down to Brooklands track, where, after the timekeepers had decided that the weather, although wet and windy, was not totally impossible, it was finally prepared for the speed attempt, filled up with petrol, and in order to save the necessity for doing initial runs at low speed to get the engine warm, the sump was filled with hot oil. Morrisol, of course, was used. The cowl was also put over the radiator to enable the heat to be retained. Then, under her own power, she was run out from the sheds into the paddock, as tractable at low speeds as a touring car. And after the timekeepers had given the OK, she was released out of the paddock onto the track and then into the final tuning bay where clean sparking plugs were fitted. And in accordance with the best record-breaking practice, the final look over for security was given to see that everything possible to ensure the driver's safety had been done. But beyond changing sparking plugs, there was practically no work at all. Fuel, oil, and water were once again checked over. The car was turned round and pushed off, and it was starting its official full-throttle trial in a very few minutes. No trouble was experienced, and back in the shed all was found to be in order and the driver perfectly comfortable. The timekeeper telephoned to say that the 100-mile-an-hour mark had been exceeded by a big margin.
At last, with the bonnet in place, the Austin 7 Special becomes recognizable as that great little car, that miracle of steel on wheels, which has contributed so much to the interest of motor racing in all the leading events. Let's see it at speed and hear it on track and road. All the crack drivers, all the latest and fastest cars compete in the many events that are run off each racing season at Brooklands, the world's first motor racing track. Brooklands, Mecca of the racing motorist, is a concrete circuit 2 3/4 miles in length, on which the Austin 7 is often prominent. When the cars roar past on the banking and the going is fast and furious, Brooklands provides its greatest thrill.
The popularity of Brooklands grew throughout the 1930s. In 1930, the clubhouse was extended to accommodate the social appeal of race meetings, and the BARC adopted the slogan, "The right crowd and no crowding." Brooklands, which was still the preserve of the wealthy amateur, became a fashionable venue on the sporting calendar along with Henley, Wimbledon and Ascot. Members of the racing club are often members of the Brooklands Flying Club as well, and the airfield was a lively part of the track. The paddock was a busy place as popular heroes mingled with those spectators who could afford a paddock transfer pass into the inner sanctuary.
Well, I think it was so exciting. I mean, when you were, young, the noise of a racing car was enormously exciting. It was all happening there. On weekdays, you could go down and something was always going on, record-breaking, testing, tremendous concourse of people there. I always said it brought everybody together, from the rogues to the aristocracy. They were all centred in the paddock because they liked motor cars and motorcycles, you see. You could go down to a motorcycle meeting at the Fork, meet a different class of person racing these fascinating motorbikes. It just was a very wonderful place. And I always thought the topography of the place was wonderful. It was really a gentleman's estate with so many different aspects of it. Motor racing is incidental, really, to a rather nice country estate in Surrey. Another rather pleasing thing about Brooklands was the facilities they had. I mean, you could have lunch there, a very good lunch there in the clubhouse. You could have a lesser lunch in the motorcyclists' restaurant. You could have tea there. You could buy drinks there. You could buy petrol for your car in the paddock. You could have a flight over on the aerodrome in an aeroplane for 5 bob. You could actually take your ordinary car around the track for 10 shillings a day. No questions asked. 5 shillings for a motorbike, 10 shillings for a car. And you could weigh your car there on the weighbridge in the clubhouse, which was, of course, really there to weigh cars before record attempts. But nevertheless, if the press came down, as they frequently did, or Car Motor, other journals, including myself and Motorsport Cars, would want to weigh a car, there were the facilities. You weighed it on the weighbridge in the paddock before you went out on the track to do the figures, or up the test hill, you see. Another thing, you had a test hill there. You could time the car, you could do brake tests down the test hill. So all sorts of facilities were laid on, even a colonial course at one time, which is just a bit of rough ground over towards the aerodrome, where people making military vehicles, 6-wheeled vehicles in those days, Morrises and Crossleys and that sort of thing, could try them on this colonial circuit. You could play tennis there in the 20s. I think that faded out later, but you had the Brooklands Lawn Tennis Club in the 20s where you could play tennis. You could do golf putting. They had a putting course there at one time to pass the time. You could lay bets. You had the totalizers from 1929, I think it was, onwards. So really, it was a very entertaining place.
Motoring journalists would bring the latest car models to the track for test drives, and car manufacturers such as Lagonda and Ford held special public days to promote and demonstrate the available range of private and commercial vehicles. The Ford Gymkhana, held in June 1939, was the biggest event Brooklands ever saw. Crowds of 30,000 were attracted to a spectacular day of demonstrations and entertainment.
On the concrete track or the turf border, these V8s twisted and turned at speed, the cars responding to their drivers like thoroughbreds, which they really are. Look at that. Driving through plate glass. What a thrill for the crowd and driver. They would have been even more thrilled had they been able to see in slow motion. No damage except to the plate glass. Fire was the next obstacle. The man who said to his girl, "I'll go through fire for you," probably owned a V8. He now swanks that he'll go through 2 fires. What a man.
But the uncertainty of war loomed ever closer, and the BARC held its last ever meeting at Brooklands on the 7th of August, 1939. The aerodrome was requisitioned by the government and was devoted to the production of Vickers and Hawker aircraft, including the Hurricane fighter and the Wellington bomber. When peace returned, everyone lived in high hopes of the racing track's eventual recovery, but the changes turned out to be too severe. Hangars had been erected on the track, and camouflage was used heavily in the form of tree planting and canvas houses to obscure the undesirable target shape around the Vickers factory. The government could not see their way to releasing Brooklands until 1949, and consequently the shareholders of Brooklands Weybridge Limited voted in favour of selling the track to Vickers Limited, and Brooklands motor racing became no more than memories.